In this session, we're going to be talking about how to Yassify your game with shaders. I'm not that knowledgeable on this, so please take it with a grain of salt. First, though, I'd like to acknowledge and honour the true owners of the land we're on today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and the Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I recognise their ongoing and unbroken connection to the land and waters and pay my respect to their elders. Sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you. My name is Teja Godson, and I'm currently hang on, there we go, that's me. I'm currently the sole 3D environment and tech artist at Summerfall Studios, who are based here in Naarm, even though I live on Gadigal land in Sydney, and that somehow isn't enough incentive for them all to move to New South Wales to hang out with me. I'm really excited to be here today because this is my first official talk. I had a panel this morning, which went really well, but it's the first time I've done a talk since grade 9 when I did stand-up comedy. I got to Parents' Night and I got an A+, so that was really good. And so I've been in game dev for about 6 years, which I love because most of my communication with anyone is through email. And working remote, it's even better because I don't have to talk to anyone in person. But now I've been at it long enough that I guess I'm good enough that people want to hear what I have to say. So I kind of have to get over my fear of public speaking, which is really cool. And the other reason that I'm excited to be here today is that for a few years now, whenever anyone asks me what I do for a job, I have to be as vague as possible and avoid dropping any hints or breaking my non-disclosure agreement. But today, after 2 long years, I get to tease some of my work on Stray Gods, the role-playing, the adventure musical. Oh, God, I wrote it wrong. Oh, damn. All right, that's cool. That's cool. I don't think Liam's here. And so I get to show off some of the awesome stuff that I've gotten to learn and create at Summerfall, which is really cool. So how many of you have heard of Stray Gods? All right, I wrote in here, that's cool, none of you. So that's actually quite a lot of people. So we're making this really cool choose your own adventure kind of mystery game. It's centered around like Greek gods, ancient magic, drama, romance. You get to romance some ancient Greek gods, which is really cool. They're not, I guess they're kind of ancient. There's a bit of an age gap, but it's fine, don't worry. I haven't actually thought about that before. It's kind of weird. So we're kind of meeting somewhere between like visual novels and The Wolf Among Us and Hades, and like K-pop stage design has been a really big inspiration for a lot of our environments, which has been cool. And so usually in our game, we've got the characters are placed within the environment, when usually with visual novels, you just kind of have them superimposed. But with ours, they sit on furniture, and getting that stupid owl to sit on that stupid little peg has just been, it's still a problem. We're still trying to deal with it. So when I started working at Summerfall, I was brought on as an environment artist, just to do the environments, and working with my art director, Benjamin E. He's right there. To bring his incredible concepts to life, which has been great. And so after grey boxing for a while and developing these scenes in 3D, we started to get to a point where there were effects that we needed that we didn't have. And so I just started problem solving. Like, that was just fun. So much of my early work with shaders in this game has just been frantic Googling, trying to create an effect that my art director had sketched, or a graphic that the team had asked for. Or just a cool thing that I thought of that I definitely didn't know how to make, but I was certain I was going to get it in there. It just felt also incomprehensible. I was just like copying nodes. I didn't know what they did. I was Googling things. I was pulling in random elements and connecting them to hopefully get closer to an outcome I was aiming for. And it felt like I was a kid. Whoops, that was a holding slide. There's a kid in the backyard potions out of like dirt and flowers, and I was like, I bet if I put enough of this in here, like I was so sure when I was a kid that if I put enough dirt and flowers and cleaning products from under the sink that my mum didn't know that I had taken. She was like, why is the Windex always out? I'm putting it in my potions. One day the stuff that I was making, it just started to kind of make sense, which was really cool. I began knowing what kind of node to reach for to help me make this specific kind of visual effect. The shortcuts started becoming second nature, and I had started making stuff I was proud of, and I kind of just ended up making a potion out of flowers, which was cool. I mean, in Unreal with shaders, so not quite. it's really fun to work on something comic styled. It feels like every day I'm trying to find loopholes and these like workarounds to trick Unreal Engine into letting me make like these halftone effects or these sketchy outlines or these flat graphic kind of light shafts. Yeah, I'm really excited to share some of the tips and tricks you may or may not have heard of to make some really cool looking stuff in Unreal. But before we get to all of that good stuff, we need to ask the first question. The most important question, a question most of you are asking yourselves, and a question that everyone who has worked in games has asked themselves at a certain point in their career. What is a shader? And thankfully, luckily, I asked some friends, coworkers, and my wife to answer this question for me. And then I have turned their responses into a quick, easy video for you today, which has got a good holding image. I didn't mean this, but no. So enjoy. It's going to be a bit quiet, but there are captions. It's not working.
Do you want me to say my parts?
No, just voice them all. I bet everyone's in the audience right now anyway. Hang on. Tech person. Hang on. Wait, is the sound going to work? There we go.
Hello, Britney Spears here.
Hi.
To my knowledge, which is poor.
A shader is a tool that devs use to add that sweet 5 o'clock shadow on Nathan Drake's face.
Part of the tech art pipeline whereby
A shader is things like umbrellas and eaves.
When there's some techno mumbo jumbo that makes things be interpreted in a visual way that's different from how it is.
And like the brims of hats.
we use logic and maths and numbers to make things look good.
And when the cloth that they put over the outdoor basketball court in primary school.
A tool that adds detail to an object, depth.
Sometimes like your hand. Those are shaders.
A shader is an algorithmic way of changing the appearance of objects during rendering.
So a shader is like when you have a whole bunch of little elves out on a football field, and they all have different umbrellas that are, some of them are see-through and some of them are not. And a magical wizard of code comes along and tells which ones to put up which umbrellas and how transparent and translucent they should be and what color they should be. And then from the sky, an eagle looks down and it looks a certain way, but it's all actually because of the wizards and the elves.
A shader is the thing that makes my wife ignore me.
That's shaders, baby.
If you're gonna be wrong, say it with confidence.
Yay, thank you all my friends. I'm glad it got such a good reception. I made that in iMovie. It was great. I am a jack of all trades. As you can see, shaders are a well understood and easy to comprehend concept. One of my favorite ways to explain what a shader is, besides the whole elf thing, is that shaders take this whole pile of data. There it is. Sick. It's just a blank slide. Shaders take a whole pile of data, 3D calculation, big old numbers, programming, and organize it in this way to output it visually. And then within that process, tech artists can instruct it to process that data in different ways, and you can create different effects and styles. And when I said this to my engineer at our studio, he said that's actually not quite correct, and that you can actually do shader stuff that doesn't output visually, but that's too complicated. So most of the time, this is basically how it works. And so I kind of do this stuff in the middle, as well as some of the stuff at the start, and also some of the stuff at the end. So that's a really generalized description, but it kind of helps us grasp the concept of what we actually do when we're making a shader. So we're writing a long list of instructions that in order us going to the GPU at runtime, and we're affecting any pixel on the screen to create the effect that we want. which is really cool. It's kind of like we're making a filter that the data's applied to, and when it passes through that, it's displayed on the screen in a certain way. So this is the kind of perception that really made the idea of shaders click in my brain, which is kind of boring. But unconventionally, shaders help us lie to people a lot. Do you want to make it look like there's a fully modeled rendered forest in the distance at a fraction of the processing costs? Those aren't actually trees. They're like weird little lumps, but it looks like there's trees. There's shaders. Do you want to make it look like you sculpted all your game models out of clay and then kind of like smushed them into the disk drive and put them in Unreal Engine? Also shaders. Do you want to make shit glow? Shaders. This is what big game dev doesn't want you to know, like shaders are just for lying to the general public. And as I was writing this talk, I was like, it's probably the most socially acceptable way of lying to a large group of people. Like no one's going to get mad at you for that. It's fine. So I think I, along with a lot of other people, got boxed into this idea of shaders, like especially before you actually figure out what they are. So it kind of feels like without having some innate inner knowledge of the workings of the universe, you're kind of just limited to changing the color of whatever material you have or making it shiny or something. So this is completely untrue. So I don't see it that way. Like I used to really heavily, and it kind of felt like the shaders were just providing guidelines that I could follow, and I could use pre-made ones, and I could change the colors and maybe change some parameters, and I was like, that's cool. Like other people can do that for me. I don't need to learn how to do that. But now I kind of see them like wielding a tool. So it's really fun working in a team that is mostly comprised of visual artists because they'll come up with these really cool effects, and then I have to figure it out. And so it's a really fun way for me to do problem solving without having to, I guess like come up with a whole new tool. So they're this vector that allows you to think outside the box in the way that 3D modeling or classic illustration might not. And yeah, once you wrap around your head around this, the doors of the potential open up and it gets really exciting. So I don't write shaders. I mostly use nodes. And every time I look at code, I vaguely want to barf. So I made this. And you should not tell Troy. So the fact that you can... Sorry, I'm laughing at my own jokes. So the fact that you can create effects just as complex and creative as written code, but with nodes, is like this huge lifesaver for artists. So the fact that you don't need to be able to write code to make cool stuff is really awesome. And I don't think if I had to write code, I would be making shaders. I just don't think that I would have tried. I don't think I would have done it. So working with my team and learning how to create these kind of effects really presented some hurdles. Shaders weren't something I really had to think about too hard before I was at Summerfall. And now I'm on a team that's composed mostly of 2D artists and illustrators, and they've never really touched Unreal or dipped a toe into tech art or really worked in 3D. So I didn't really have anyone on the team to learn from or to ask stupid questions to whenever I had an issue, simply because I hadn't connected a node right. Thankfully, I was able to turn to Chris Murphy, who has been absolutely invaluable for teaching me tech art. But for the most part, I was relying on 2008 YouTube tutorials in Russian for my problem solving. And also the same forum posts that I just kept finding again and again because I forgot that I had figured out the answer. Oops, which way are we going? Yeah, holding slide. Another hurdle I encountered was Unreal Engine itself. So it's this hugely impressive piece of software, but entirely 100% built to make these really cool photorealistic designs. It wants you, when you start out, to use shading and ambient occlusion and vignettes and specular, and I turn all of that off because that's not what we're doing. So building a comic-style 3D environment is like pulling teeth with Unreal. Like, it's not like pulling teeth for me. Keep pressing the buttons. It's like kind of turning Unreal inside out. It's just kind of pulling it really out of its comfort zone. So most of our game is really illustrative and expressive. So most of my tech art is finding really cool workarounds and making these really flat, flashy overlays. So thankfully, this actually makes my work easier sometimes because I don't have to kind of get bogged down with intricate normal maps and stuff, and I can just work with opacity masks and textures, and that's really fun for me. So the first step in developing a new kind of effect is meeting with my art director about the new scene that we're making. Benjamin E. Incredible Man illustrates some incredibly magical and beautiful environment concepts like these. I hope you like his work. I know, they're so minimalist. Yeah, they're great. Generally, when I start work on one, we'll sit down to discuss, what needs the most focus and what kind of new effects and shaders I'm going to create, and collaborate on workarounds to get that kind of juicy graphic style that we're going for. So I've got a relatively large library of stuff already that I've made, so most of my standard shaders are kind of already done. I've got a bunch of different use cases, and setting up a new scene is as easy as duplicating some of the materials and playing around. But getting cracking on something new is where it gets fun. When making a new shader, I like to break it down. I find deciding on what parameters I want to expose early on helps me plan a good layout. Like, I generally won't stick to the plan, but making one makes me feel more confident, and it means that I'll actually start. But once I get in there, it's anybody's game. So breaking the effect down into chunks, I can decide what parameters I want to expose, what I want to be able to edit after I've compiled the shader and once I'm using it as a material instance. So developing each section separately before linking them all together means that I don't get caught up in stressing about the macro or getting confused about how all the sections interplay before I've even made them. Also, just a warning, a lot of the ways that I make shaders is probably horrific to anyone that actually knows shaders as well. Some of the workarounds I've written here, some of the workarounds I do would make a real learned tech artist want to scream. I have never learnt or been taught these skills in any professional capacity. I hope some of you find what you're about to hear helpful. All right, so this first effect, which is cool. So you don't usually see this kind of stuff on Unreal. This was one of the first ones that I made. Breaking this down, when I started this, I went, okay, well, I want 3 different frames for the lightning. I want them to work on a loop. I want parameters to change the independent colors of the frames, the speed of the loop, and the opacity of whichever texture I'm using. And so our material is already set up as unlit and unmasked, so it really feels, illustrated. So the textures for this lightning I drew in my alternative for Photoshop, which is Affinity Photo, which is really good because it doesn't have a subscription model. External drawing programs I find really useful since we go for a really sketchy style at Summerfall. Since we want to externally control the parameters for the colors, we don't have to bake those into the texture. So all I'm using here with these red, green, and blue channels is just opacity. Like, this is just the alpha that I'm working with here. So I just tend to lay these together with an add function. And then I can just tuck them into Unity. Unreal. I can chuck them into Unreal. And then separate them back out and use them for alpha, which is, a really cool tech art magic skill of combining 3 textures into one. And so we also want to, this is where it gets nerdy, we want to be able to set up a sort of loop for, is this a loop one? Yeah, it is. We also want to be able to set up a loop for these frames to run on, and I want to be able to change the speed that the frames run through. So since making a proper loop based on Tick and Unreal 4 is hell, I set it up with a sine node. So a basic sine wave right here is going to run from -1 to 1. And so a lot of the time in shaders, we want to keep things between 0 and 1 because those are the kind of, as soon as you go below 0 or above 1, it's just going to be black or white and you're not going to get any variation. So if we add an integer of 1 to this, it's going to run from 0 to 2. And then once we divide that by 2, it's going to run from 0 to 1. And so we have our range that we need. So if we add a divide node up there, if we add a divide node and input our time data and then this little parameter up here, if we change this value, the speed at which that sine wave is going to output its numbers is going to be slower. And so we're going to have a much slower loop. So finally, this is me setting up the editable color of the frames. So I have these 3 parameters that will be exposed once you have the material instance. And so you can change this to whatever you want. And those lerp together, we're going to have a look in a sec at some of the logic nodes that I set up. And I don't know if I did them right, but it works. Some of these set up, I'll press the button and then they'll come in half a second later. So this is the really simple kind of multiply and power node setup that I have for a lot of my materials, which is you kind of just chuck in a value to multiply it by, and that just will just change your opacity. So you can have it lower, you can have it higher, especially if you have something really sketchy. If you have a really sketchy texture, you actually get a whole lot of control with the opacity masking, and that's really, really fun. So that one is really messy, but I link these all together with some logic nodes. And so depending on the output of the sine loop, one of the different lightning frames is called from that picture that we did. And then I also set this up so that all of those colors would link together in the same way. And so those all link to a particular lightning frame, which is really cool. So I set this up with one of the frames visible from 0.15 and below, and then I just did this by eye, and then one of them visible from 0.85 and above, which kind of means that they all just have a similar amount of time on the loop. This was very by eye. Like, this is very sketchy work. And so these are some of the cool effects that we can get if we play around with those parameters afterwards. And so you can see it kind of boomerangs back and forth. Like, it's not a perfect loop, but, you know, it looks pretty good. And it's going to be really good for a kind of comic style game. And so the next one was really fun. So this one I was kind of scratching my head about, but at the same time, it was a really surprisingly simple solution. So this was when we really started to pull from Into the Spider-Verse for some of our ideas. So I wanted to create this halftone effect that you can see in a bunch of these images. I wanted to kind of overlay it on light shafts so that it kind of looked a lot more comic book-like, because a lot of them were feeling a little 3D, and we wanted to kind of push them a bit further. And so I could have really easily just created a halftone texture and chucked it in and called it a day, but I wanted to be able to use it in a whole bunch of different use cases. And so I wanted the ability to change the size of the dots, and I wanted to be able to apply the material to 3D objects and use some of that 3D data to make the designs look really cool. I'm so sorry, my brain just blanked. So I wanted, I wanted to be able to use this material really easily, and I wanted anyone else that was using this material to also be using it easily, which was really fun. So first thing I did was a seamless texture. So I made a whole bunch of these blurry little dots, which meant that when I did that multiply thing that I did with the other texture, I could change the size of them depending on how strong or faint those dots were. So I set this texture up to tile across the screen space, which kind of means that when you move, the image stays where it is on the screen, and the object just kind of masks a space that it displays for you. So in comparison to this little 3D one we have down in the corner, based on this other one, it gives it this really flat comic book effect, which is really awesome, and I use it a lot in some of the stuff that we do. So it applies it in a really beautiful illustrated way. So sometimes they can feel a little janky if you're moving around in 3D space, but if you've got them just in a kind of set camera environment, which we do for a lot of our scenes, they can feel really, really nice. So I wanted this halftone to fade in from the sides of a cone of light, which was a really fun piece of problem solving. So a Fresnel function, this is a little bit technical, but a Fresnel function increases its value, increases its output as your eye line becomes tangential, basically, to the edge of an object. So you can see in that black and white image in the top, you've got that white value on the sides of the object, and at the plane at the bottom, you're not getting any of that because it's all front on, you're seeing all of it. So once you multiply that with the opacity of this texture that you already have, you're gonna get this really cool display of dots where they fade in from the side. I'm gonna take my watch off because Siri's hearing me. Siri's listening to me talk. So yeah, I can take the data from this Fresnel function and add it, and it really looks gorgeous. And so you can add a whole bunch of different parameters to this to increase and decrease how strong that effect is and how big or how small the dots are and how they scale. And that's really that has been such a helpful element in making a lot of our designs in the game. So I added a few scalar parameters. into this, which adds some customization ability for us later. And so we add a node here to scale the texture, which lets us kind of scale the spacing between the dots. We add a vector3 parameter so that we can change the color. We can let that be anything we want. You can add more stuff in here. I added some emissive, so you can see that gold one there is glowing, so you can make it as bright as you want. And yeah, with some fiddling around, you can take some of the values into the negatives, like that black one on the side, you can have the opposite effect. Yeah, you can change those dots to anything you want as well. So that one looks really cool when it's in game, but I'm not going to show you any of that because I'm not allowed to. So the next one, this one took me a while. This was one of the ones I spent ages on. I was watching, 2008 tutorial after 2008 tutorial. I was trying to find the best way to capture her. She was difficult. She's not even that good, but I love her because she's this culmination of all of my mediocre knowledge. I made this one I think it was almost a year ago now when I made this. So making a fire effect, especially something stylized in Unreal, is really hard. You know that after I made this, I found dozens of other ways I could have done this easier, but I didn't. And so this one is kind of what made that veil of imposter syndrome lift for a second. So that was kind of like I can actually kind of do this now. Like I came up with this and it looks really good. And so that one made me feel really good for a short amount of time. So I wanted this really simple fire effect. And I still don't know how to animate, and so I wanted it to be flexible for this wide amount of use cases. But I didn't want to have to, do it frame by frame. So I broke it down. I needed an organic shape. I needed it to have fluid movement, no noticeable repetitions. I wanted to change its speed, its color, the sharpness of the flame edge. And so since this one is more complex, I'm going to skim over it a little bit more. But I started with these two chunky kind of blobby textures, these kind of cloud textures, and I just set them up to pan across to the top right, but I also set them up with a sine node, so you can kind of see, if you look at it, it'll fade between the two of them. It's really subtle, but that kind of gives us that organic. So these will end up subtracting from our main fire state later, and the way that they move between each other really kind of tricks the eye into thinking that everything is really dynamic. So to create the main body, so this is kind of the node graph that I did. I will have this. I'll put this these slides up somewhere. So if anyone wants to take the notes, they're more than welcome to. So this is how I set it up. And then I also at the end set up this control. I set it as cutout control, but it's basically setting up how bright and how contrasting those textures previously were, which means that we can change how much of those cut out of our main fire later. So what I did was I took these two basically just circular gradients, and I kind of shoved them around a little bit with some nodes, so I kind of scaled them. And then I multiplied them together, and so we get this kind of egg shape, which is kind of the perfect little flame shape, which is really cool. So that's the main body of our flame, and that's just going to make it really easy to chuck things on top, move things around, just a really nice basis. It's really fun that you can do this in Unreal, so you can just make gradients and just scale them, and then you can just add them together. And I can make a little Mickey Mouse face if I wanted. It's just cool, just circles. So when we pull away that original panning texture from the weird little blobby egg shape, this is the effect that we get, which looks really cool. That's a flame. That's kind of already there, and you haven't even done that much yet. So I wanted to do this subtle wind movement, because this one from before, its base is really static. You can tell it's not really a flame. It kind of looks like you just have a panning texture over an egg shape. But once you add, I had made this kind of blobby column. I make most of my textures in Substance Designer, but you can really just do them in whatever you want. I had this panning directly upwards. And as that kind of column moves over the fire and subtracts from it, it makes it look like it's wafting. And sure, there's a bit of repetition, but with everything else that we're adding, you're really not going to be able to tell. So this was the edge control that I had. So again, this is just a multiply node and a power node, and this just lets us change, the brightness and the contrast of the image that we're creating. And once this is applied to the opacity of the texture, it's really going to be able to let us make something more cartoony or something more realistic, and just having as many parameters as possible is always good for making it feel organic. And so one really cool thing that I learnt while making this fire was how to use color curves. So our flame is entirely in black and white so far. But when I started this shader, I know I wanted to add color at the end once I was done so that it didn't get all mixed up in all the effects I was using. So I thought that I would have to do a lot of that with a whole lot of vector 3 nodes and multiplying them together and adding them and using opacity and all that. But it turns out that Unreal 4 has a very similar function to gradient mapping in a lot of photo editing and illustration software, which is really cool. So generally with a gradient, you've got 0 to 1, and that is just basically numbers. That's just from 0 to 1 and every little bit in between. And so what you can do with gradient mapping and color curves is set colors to particular points on that gradient, and they're just going to smoothly lerp in between that. And that lets us make, especially if you're changing skin colors, if you're making a whole bunch of different skins in your video game, you can set up a bunch of these. They take up a whole lot less space than a new texture will, and you can do them a lot faster. So this is just some examples of gradient mapping. As you can see, they just take the lowest values on the left and move them to the highest values on the right, and you can just set them to whatever you want. You can make them look really weird, like that little house down in the bottom right. I don't really like it, but it's a good example. It makes me feel really weird. And you can see on the bottom left that there's a whole bunch of different examples of just how you can recolor an image like that. So adding a whole bunch that I made that you saw on the previous slide, I added them in here to this color control parameter. So these are all stored in one little file, which is just a little gradient map file. And so I had 4, you can add as many as you want into your little gradient map library, and then you can call them whenever you want. So that can be at runtime, that can be in your material instance, that can be whenever you want. So that was really fun. And so I also added an emissive value there, which will also help us change the color of our fire. And so to work with the opacity in this, I just took our original fire black and white value and I plugged it into the opacity. And so all that's going to do is just wherever it's black, it's clear, and wherever it's white, it's opaque. And that's going to give us that really soft-edged fire look, which is really, really fun. And that really simplifies everything. So if you make any changes to any of those panning materials or anything from the start, it's all going to hook up to the same place, and that's going to change along with everything else. And so that just simplifies it. There's another holding slide. So creating shaders and effects in this style is really fun, but not just because I enjoy the outcome and looking at something pretty I made. Like I do enjoy making things that look pretty, but if I just wanted to make pretty things all the time, I don't think I would still be in my job, because you don't make pretty stuff all the time. And like I assume everyone here, I am constantly racked with imposter syndrome. So that makes it a little more tricky. But learning is really where I get my kicks in this job. So the rush of problem solving something and figuring something out and spending 3 days on a problem and finally getting it, like that's what feels good. Then I go make a cup of tea and actually relax. But it's fun to figure it out, not just because you guessed, but because you learnt and actually understood what you were looking at. Like that is what feels really good, because that's when you know when you're making progress. So you're always going to go through periods of time where you don't like how your art looks or your shaders look or your programming looks. And as you learn more about your chosen vocation, your ability to both create it and perceive it is going to get better. And I bet everyone's seen this on Twitter. This is very, very normal. So as your artistic skills increase, your observation skills are going to increase, but they're not going to increase together. So you're going to have those times when you think you are God's gift to the earth and your stuff's actually not as good as you think it is. And at the other side of that, you're going to have times when your artistic skill, for whatever reason, has plateaued for a little bit. but your skill at seeing art has skyrocketed, and everything that you look at that you've done looks bad, but it doesn't. It doesn't, and past you would be in awe of the things that you have done. So I'm actually currently in this rut, which is really fun at work. So I love everything I do, and everything looks great, I promise. So understanding this process will mean that you can really push through, and you will see the results, as long as you just keep going. So I find my fun in the problem solving and the feeling that I cheated the system and created something that was never meant to be created. I bent the rules and I found a loophole, and that keeps me going. Like, sure, I get an awesome outcome at the end of it visually, but the drive to keep improving my problem solving and my rule breaking is what really keeps me going. Don't just do something to make it pretty. Maybe start doing something because you want to make something pretty, but you're not going to make something that you find pretty every time. Finding value and energy in the problem solving is what's going to keep you moving when you're learning something new, and finding that elation when you start getting a different error code is so good. It's so good. You're like, oh my gosh, I finally fixed one problem. I can move on to the next 6,000 that I have. I think deciding on what you want out of an effect you want to create, especially in Unreal, and sticking to that, like, don't feel downtrodden just because the engine doesn't want to do it on the first go. Like, you can learn to create an add-on. You can find someone who's broken it. It's fine. You can just break the software. There's a 2008 Russian tutorial out there for everyone, kind of like a Zodiac. I'm how to make a fire shader rising. Thank you. I just came up with that, so that's why it was a bit weird. If you can't think of a potential solution, or no, if you do think of a potential solution but you think it's too silly, I can guarantee that someone's done it before and it's worked. So you may as well. I literally put black planes in parts of my project because cinematic artists will come up to me and say, we can see something weird over there. Can we? And I'll go, oh, I could change the shader, or I could remodel that, or we could just put a cube in the way and we could make it black and then you can't see it. And they're like, great, that's perfect, thank you. It's so much cheaper in time and processing power. And it's how every video game is made. Everyone does it constantly. Sure, you wouldn't build a house from straw because the wolf would simply blow it down. But there aren't any wolves in Unreal Engine 4, unless you put them in there. We're living in a digital world where you can bend physics and camera angles to our will. So go forth and make something disgusting, because from the player's perspective, it will be beautiful. Thank you. And now we have questions, if anyone wants to know anything about any of my stuff. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
So this is probably kind of dumb because you've been carrying all of this.
There are no dumb questions. Absolutely not. Absolutely none.
Oh, I'll challenge you for that.
Okay. Okay, excellent.
You've been talking mostly about Unreal Engine 4, but I'm assuming that most of this won't be transferable to things like Unity Engine.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a different system, but absolutely there's shaders in, like, it's just, shaders are just kind of how you tell the data to be displayed on a screen.
Oh, no, I meant the node system.
Oh, yeah. I haven't really done a lot in Unity, but I think a lot of the skills are really transferable. So even if it's not exactly the same node system, I'm pretty sure Unity has something incredibly similar.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good. Amplify shader. The Amplify shader nodes in Unity are pretty much the same thing. Josh can come up and answer my questions. Yeah, there is. Yay.
Heya.
Hi.
What shader are you most proud of creating so far?
Ooh, probably that fire one. Even though I kind of want to redo it. I think the fact that I didn't take a lot of influence from anyone else's work and I kind of just figured it out, I think just made me really proud of myself. So even if I'm not proud of the outcome, it makes me proud of myself.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. That was awesome. Loved
Thank
it.
you.
So, yeah, my question is about working out when to change tactics or stop working on something, because, again, with the fire, I've done something similar before,
Yeah.
right? That's like one of the first things I was doing when I was learning, but it turned out awfully.
Yeah.
And I ended up moving away from a shader, doing a particle effect. So how can you work out when to cut your losses and change a tactic, whether it's because the visual outcome isn't working or the technical outcome isn't there, or...
I think if you're doing it as a hobby, you can really just change whenever you do feel like it, which is really nice. And because you can save all of them, obviously don't delete any of the work that you've done, because you can go back and go, hey, I solved this problem back in an old one, copy paste some stuff and you have some solutions. I don't actually know if I've figured out where to cut my losses yet. I'm someone who will just keep working on something.
Is it something you come across fairly frequently, or is it just me?
Thankfully not at the moment. Sometimes I do spend a little too long on things, but because most of the stuff in our project is really simple, it's been really nice. But I think if I got properly into tech art and I properly became someone who was creating hyper-realistic effects and really complex chain events, I could very definitely fall into that hole. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Wonderful. I think that might be it. Oh, one more. Thank you.
I think you may have answered this, but I just want to check that I understood what you were doing there when you were mentioning the gradient maps.
Yeah.
Did you use a gradient image, or is there a node in Unreal where you can actually determine those colors?
Yeah.
Because that's
I
new
know,
to me.
it's crazy. So there is actually a file. You can do like a right-click, create new, create new file. There is actually a gradient object that you can create. So this isn't an image. You can just change those sliders.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's really good. And then you can lump them all together into like a little gradient map.
Okay.
And then you can pull any of them from there.
Right, because I was going to ask if it was just like a solid color that you were like blending on top of the black
Yeah,
and white or
no,
something.
no, it's, you can make them really, really fast.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, of course.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It was great. I have a bit of a question.
Yeah.
So I've always understood like shaders and texturing kind of working together, but they are separate things. But what I've noticed now that, Substance Painter and Designer start to become more of like a thing, I guess, where does the making shaders start and the Substance Designer texture making end?
Yeah.
And how do they intersect? Because, you can make those blobby little noise things, and you can make them move in Unreal or whatever game engine of your choice. But I guess where do you stop using Substance to make the texture and start using the engine?
No, absolutely. So for things like this one, you could make this final result straight in Substance. There's a lot of overlap between the two of them, which is really cool. A lot of the time I will just use Substance to make my really basic textures like those panning ones that I had. And thankfully, there is a ton of overlap. So it's kind of Unreal has a bit of limitation when it comes to, transforming a lot of textures. It won't do a lot of stuff. There's a lot of blend modes that you find in Substance that you won't find in Unreal, or at least it's a lot harder to set them up. And so in those points, unless you really need that customization and the ability to change those parameters, it can be a lot easier. But at the time, it's really just what is going to be easier for you. And sometimes that's going to be trial and error to find out what's easier to do in which one. But honestly, if it's a static texture that you need, I'd say do it in Substance.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're just creating more processing power in Unreal in whatever game that you're making.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. But can you make a fully fledged moving shader in Designer and bring it into Engine, or does that not?
Look, I think it would be a little tricky.
Yeah.
You'd have to bring it in with... I honestly haven't actually looked into it too far in terms of bringing in animations, but I think it would be a lot more difficult in terms of frames and things, and I think you'd be a lot better off, just doing all the animating, because you can do a lot of UV map editing in Unreal with the nodes. Yeah.
Oh, good. No, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I think we're at just about time. We've got about 5 minutes left, but I think I might let everyone go early. But thank you so much for coming to my first talk.